Question 1. Strategic planning requires a comprehensive understanding of available resources and their intended purposes. Considering the strict guidelines of FEMA Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, HMGP, which is designed to fund projects that reduce future risk from disasters, what is the most appropriate course of action for an emergency manager when faced with community requests for immediate, non-mitigation-related recovery funding following a major disaster? Option A. Advocate for the community's immediate needs by reallocating HMGP funds to address urgent, non-mitigation-related recovery efforts, while planning to address mitigation later. Option B. Expedite the HMGP application process for all requests, regardless of mitigation eligibility, to ensure funds are disbursed quickly to address the most pressing community concerns. Option C. Focus solely on securing HMGP funding for projects that offer the most visible and immediate impact, even if their long-term mitigation benefits are questionable. Option D. Prioritize HMGP applications that clearly demonstrate a direct link to reducing future disaster risk and align with the program's mitigation objectives, while simultaneously exploring alternative funding sources for immediate recovery needs. The correct answer is A. Advocate for the community's immediate needs by reallocating HMGP funds to address urgent, non-mitigation-related recovery efforts, while planning to address mitigation later. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing immediate community needs with the stringent requirements of federal grant programs, specifically FEMA Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, HMGP. The pressure to deploy funds quickly for visible recovery efforts can conflict with the meticulous planning, documentation, and eligibility verification mandated by HMGP. A professional emergency manager must navigate this tension by adhering to the grant's purpose and regulations, while advocating for the community's long-term resilience. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes adherence to the HMGP core objective, reducing future risk and promoting mitigation. By focusing on eligible mitigation activities that align with the grant's purpose and ensuring all documentation meets FEMA standards, the emergency manager upholds the integrity of the grant program and maximizes the likelihood of successful funding and long-term impact. This demonstrates a commitment to responsible stewardship of federal funds and a strategic vision for community resilience, as required by professional emergency management standards. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on immediate, non-mitigation-related recovery efforts fails to comply with the fundamental purpose of the HMGP. This would constitute a regulatory failure, as HMGP funds are specifically designated for hazard mitigation, not general disaster relief or short-term recovery. Another incorrect approach that bypasses proper documentation and eligibility checks for expediency would represent a significant compliance failure. This risks grant denial, recoupment of funds, and potential penalties, undermining the credibility of the emergency management agency and jeopardizing future funding opportunities. It also violates ethical obligations to manage public funds responsibly. A third incorrect approach that prioritizes projects based on political expediency rather than mitigation potential or eligibility criteria would be a failure of professional judgment and potentially an ethical breach, as it deviates from the objective criteria established by the grant program and could lead to inefficient use of resources. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of the specific grant program's objectives, eligibility criteria, and reporting requirements. This should be followed by a systematic assessment of potential projects against these criteria, prioritizing those that offer the greatest mitigation benefit and are fully compliant. Robust documentation and transparent communication with the granting agency are crucial throughout the process. Finally, a commitment to continuous learning and adaptation to evolving grant guidelines ensures ongoing compliance and effective program management. Question 2. The evaluation methodology shows a critical divergence in how preliminary damage assessment (PDA) findings are translated into detailed damage assessment and subsequent needs analysis for housing, infrastructure, and economic impact. Considering the regulatory framework for disaster recovery, which approach best ensures a comprehensive, equitable, and effective recovery strategy? Option A. Prioritizing a systematic, multi-phased assessment process that begins with a rapid PDA, followed by detailed assessments of all affected sectors: housing, infrastructure, economic impact, using standardized data collection and stakeholder input, culminating in comprehensive reporting. Option B, focusing initial detailed assessments and resource allocation exclusively on the restoration of critical public infrastructure, with housing and economic impact analyses conducted only after infrastructure is deemed functional. Option C, conducting a comprehensive data collection and analysis phase only after initial, ad hoc recovery efforts have been implemented to validate the effectiveness of the actions taken. Option D, relying primarily on anecdotal reports from first responders and community leaders to inform detailed damage assessments and immediate recovery priorities, with formal data collection deferred until later stages. The correct answer is A, prioritizing a systematic multi-phased assessment process that begins with a rapid PDA, followed by detailed assessments of all affected sectors, housing, infrastructure, economic impact, using standardized data collection and stakeholder input, culminating in comprehensive reporting. Explanation: the evaluation methodology shows a critical juncture in disaster recovery operations, where the accuracy and comprehensiveness of damage assessment directly influence the effectiveness of subsequent recovery efforts. This scenario is professionally challenging because preliminary damage assessments, PDA, are often conducted under extreme time pressure, with limited resources, and in hazardous conditions, requiring rapid yet informed decision-making. The subsequent detailed damage assessment and needs analysis must build upon this initial foundation, ensuring that all affected sectors, particularly housing and critical infrastructure, are accurately evaluated to inform resource allocation and recovery planning. Ethical considerations are paramount, as misjudgments can lead to inequitable distribution of aid, prolonged suffering for affected populations, and a failure to meet the core mandate of emergency management. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a systematic, multi-phased assessment process that aligns with established disaster recovery frameworks, such as those outlined by FEMA in the United States. This involves a rigorous PDA to quickly identify immediate life safety concerns and broad impact areas, followed by a detailed damage assessment that quantifies the extent of damage to housing, infrastructure, e.g., transportation, utilities, public facilities, and the economic impact on businesses and livelihoods. A robust needs assessment methodology, incorporating stakeholder input from affected communities, local government, and relevant agencies, ensures that recovery plans are tailored to actual needs and priorities. Data collection and analysis must be standardized and verifiable, leading to comprehensive reporting and documentation that supports funding requests, informs policy, and facilitates future preparedness. This methodical approach ensures accountability, transparency, and maximizes the likelihood of a resilient and equitable recovery, adhering to regulatory requirements for disaster assistance and program management. An incorrect approach that relies solely on anecdotal evidence from first responders for detailed damage assessment and needs analysis fails to meet professional standards. This approach is ethically flawed as it lacks objectivity and can lead to biased resource allocation, potentially neglecting less visible but equally critical needs. It also violates regulatory requirements for data-driven decision-making in disaster recovery, which mandate systematic data collection and analysis to justify aid and program implementation. Another incorrect approach that focuses exclusively on the immediate restoration of critical infrastructure without a concurrent, thorough assessment of housing needs and economic impact is also professionally deficient. While infrastructure is vital, neglecting housing and economic recovery creates a fragmented and incomplete recovery picture. This can lead to long-term social and economic instability for affected populations, failing to address the holistic needs of a community, and potentially violating the spirit and letter of disaster recovery legislation that emphasizes comprehensive community resilience. A third incorrect approach that delays comprehensive data collection and analysis until after initial recovery efforts have begun is procedurally unsound and ethically questionable. This delay can result in misallocation of resources, duplication of efforts, and a failure to capture the full scope of damage and needs. It undermines the principle of evidence-based decision-making and can lead to a less efficient and less equitable recovery, potentially jeopardizing the long-term viability of recovery programs and the well-being of the affected population. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of the phased nature of disaster recovery assessments, adherence to established methodologies, and a commitment to data integrity and stakeholder engagement. Professionals must continuously evaluate the quality and completeness of data, ensuring that assessments are both timely and thorough. They should also be prepared to adapt methodologies based on the unique characteristics of the disaster and the affected environment, always prioritizing transparency, equity, and accountability in their actions and recommendations. Question 3. Risk assessment procedures indicate a magnitude 7.2 earthquake has struck a densely populated urban area, causing widespread structural damage, power outages, and disruptions to transportation networks. Initial reports indicate numerous trapped individuals, significant injuries, and a growing need for temporary shelter. Emergency services are overwhelmed. As the designated professional emergency manager, what is the most appropriate initial course of action to manage this disaster response? Option A. Bypass standard resource request protocols and direct emergency personnel to independently seek out and secure necessary supplies and equipment from any available source to expedite the response. Option B. Prioritize the immediate mobilization of all available heavy equipment for debris removal to clear major transportation arteries, as this will facilitate subsequent rescue and medical efforts. Option C. Immediately establish a unified command structure, initiate rapid damage assessment across all affected sectors, and begin coordinating the deployment of search and rescue teams and the establishment of mass care and sheltering operations. Option D. Delay the activation of mass care and sheltering operations until a comprehensive hazardous materials assessment is completed to ensure the safety of potential shelter locations. The correct answer is C. Immediately establish a unified command structure, initiate rapid damage assessment across all affected sectors, and begin coordinating the deployment of search and rescue teams and the establishment of mass care and sheltering operations. Explanation. This scenario presents a professionally challenging situation due to the immediate and cascading impacts of a significant seismic event on critical infrastructure and public safety. The challenge lies in rapidly prioritizing and allocating limited resources across multiple, simultaneous demands, while adhering to established emergency management protocols and legal mandates. Effective decision-making requires a nuanced understanding of interdependencies between different response functions and a commitment to ethical principles of equity and public welfare. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes life safety and the establishment of essential support functions in a systematic and legally compliant manner. This aligns with the core tenets of emergency management, emphasizing a phased response that moves from immediate life-saving to stabilization and recovery. Specifically, it adheres to the National Incident Management System, NIMS, principles of incident command, resource management, and the legal framework governing emergency response, which mandates the protection of life and property. The focus on establishing a unified command, conducting rapid damage assessments to inform resource deployment, and initiating mass care and sheltering addresses the most urgent needs of the affected population in a structured and accountable way. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on debris removal without first addressing immediate life-saving and sheltering needs represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This would violate the paramount duty to protect human life, which is a foundational principle in emergency management law and ethics. Prioritizing property over people in the initial response is a clear dereliction of duty. Another incorrect approach that delays the establishment of public health and medical services to focus on hazardous materials response, while important, would be a failure if it meant neglecting immediate medical needs of injured individuals. While hazmat is critical, the immediate triage and treatment of casualties take precedence under most emergency response frameworks. This demonstrates a misapplication of prioritization principles. An incorrect approach that bypasses established resource management protocols and relies on ad hoc requests without proper accountability or verification would undermine the integrity of the response and potentially lead to inefficient or ineffective resource allocation. This contravenes established guidelines for resource management, which are designed to ensure equitable distribution and prevent waste. A professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a rapid assessment of the incident, followed by the activation of the Incident Command System, ICS. This includes establishing clear lines of authority and communication. The next step is to prioritize immediate life-saving actions, followed by the assessment of critical infrastructure and the establishment of essential services like sheltering and medical care. Resource needs should be identified and requested through established channels, ensuring proper documentation and accountability. Continuous reassessment of the situation and adaptation of the response plan are crucial throughout the incident lifecycle. Question 4. The performance metrics show a significant delay in establishing a coordinated response across multiple jurisdictions following a large-scale hazardous materials incident. The incident commander has been issuing direct operational orders to various teams without formally establishing a unified command or clearly defining roles for command and general staff. What is the most appropriate immediate action to ensure effective disaster response and adherence to best practices? Option A. Instruct the incident commander to delegate specific operational tasks to individual team leaders without formalizing the ICS structure, emphasizing speed over documentation. Option B. Continue with the current direct operational order approach, focusing on maximizing immediate tactical efforts by the incident commander to mitigate the immediate threat. Option C. Immediately convene all involved agency heads to establish a unified command structure, clearly define incident objectives, and assign roles to the command and general staff based on NIMS principles. Option D. Advise the incident commander to focus solely on internal agency coordination and resource allocation, deferring external agency integration until the immediate crisis has stabilized. The correct answer is C. Immediately convene all involved agency heads to establish a unified command structure, clearly define incident objectives, and assign roles to the command and general staff based on NIMS principles. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in disaster response, a rapidly evolving, multi-jurisdictional incident requiring effective coordination and clear communication. The professional challenge lies in ensuring that the Incident Command System, ICS, is implemented correctly and efficiently, despite the complexities introduced by multiple agencies and the need for unified decision-making. Failure to adhere to ICS principles can lead to duplicated efforts, missed critical tasks, conflicting directives, and ultimately a compromised response that endangers both responders and the affected population. The pressure of time and limited resources, further, exacerbates the need for precise application of ICS structure and responsibilities. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach emphasizes establishing a unified command structure early in the incident. This aligns with best practices for multi-agency incidents as outlined in PEM National Incident Management System, NIMS, which is the foundational framework for ICS in the U.S. Unified Command allows agencies with jurisdictional responsibility or functional authority to work together to establish a common set of objectives and strategies. This ensures that all responding agencies are working towards the same goals, leveraging their respective resources and expertise effectively. The incident commander, or in this case, the unified commanders, would delegate responsibilities to the command and general staff, ensuring clear lines of authority and accountability. The Public Information Officer, PO, would manage public communications. The liaison officer would coordinate with external agencies not directly involved in the unified command, and the safety officer would proactively identify and mitigate hazards. The general staff operations, planning, logistics, finance/administration, would then execute the incident objectives under the direction of the unified command. This structured approach maximizes efficiency, resource utilization, and situational awareness, which are critical for successful disaster response. Incorrect approach is analysis, an approach that focuses solely on one agency's internal procedures without establishing a unified command structure would be a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This would violate the principles of multi-agency coordination and could lead to conflicting priorities and resource allocation, undermining the overall effectiveness of the response. It fails to acknowledge the shared responsibility for managing the incident and could result in a fragmented and inefficient response, potentially jeopardizing public safety. Another incorrect approach would be to bypass the established command and general staff roles and have the incident commander directly manage all tactical operations. This violates the core principle of ICS, which is to modularly expand and delegate responsibilities to manage complexity. This direct management approach would quickly overwhelm the incident commander, leading to poor decision-making, burnout, and a lack of focus on strategic planning and resource management. It also fails to utilize the specialized expertise within the general staff, hindering effective operations, planning, and logistics. A third incorrect approach would be to delay the establishment of clear communication channels and documentation processes. This would lead to a lack of situational awareness, missed opportunities for resource requests, and an inability to track progress or learn from the incident. Proper documentation, including the use of ICS forms, is essential for accountability, legal defensibility, and post-incident analysis, all of which are critical components of a professional emergency management response. The failure to document can lead to significant challenges in resource reimbursement, legal challenges, and hinder future preparedness efforts. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach this scenario by first recognizing the need for immediate establishment of ICS, specifically a unified command if multiple agencies are involved. The decision-making process should prioritize adherence to NIMS principles, focusing on clear delegation of authority, effective communication, and robust documentation. The incident commander, or unified commanders, must assess the incident's scope and complexity to determine the appropriate ICS organizational structure. This involves identifying all relevant agencies and stakeholders, establishing clear objectives, and assigning roles and responsibilities to the command and general staff. Continuous assessment of the incident's progression and the effectiveness of the ICS structure is paramount, with adjustments made as necessary to ensure an optimal response. Question 5. Market research demonstrates that communities are increasingly facing complex and cascading disaster events. A professional emergency manager, PEM, is tasked with developing a comprehensive preparedness strategy for their jurisdiction, facing significant budget limitations. Which of the following approaches best aligns with the PEM's professional responsibilities and regulatory obligations for ensuring long-term community resilience? Option A. Prioritize investments in advanced early warning systems and robust public communication platforms, while simultaneously initiating a phased program to harden critical infrastructure against identified future threats and integrating community-based preparedness training into local educational curricula. Option B. Invest in a single, highly visible mitigation project that addresses a prominent but less probable disaster scenario, while deferring investments in less visible but more probable threats to future budget cycles. Option C. Allocate the majority of the budget to public awareness campaigns about general disaster preparedness, with a minimal allocation for specialized training for emergency responders, believing that broad public knowledge is sufficient. Option D. Focus all available resources on acquiring the latest response equipment and conducting frequent large-scale evacuation drills, assuming that immediate response capabilities are the primary determinant of community safety. The correct answer is A. Prioritize investments in advanced early warning systems and robust public communication platforms, while simultaneously initiating a phased program to harden critical infrastructure against identified future threats and integrating community-based preparedness training into local educational curricula. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between immediate operational needs and long-term strategic planning, particularly when resource allocation is constrained. The professional emergency manager, PEM, must balance the urgency of current threats with the foresight required for future resilience, all while adhering to established regulatory frameworks and ethical obligations. Careful judgment is required to ensure that decisions are not only effective in the short term, but also sustainable and compliant in the long term. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a comprehensive, data-driven assessment of both immediate and future risks, aligning with the PEM's ethical duty to protect public safety and welfare. This approach is grounded in the principles of proactive risk management and strategic resource deployment, which are fundamental to effective emergency management as outlined in relevant professional standards and potentially codified in jurisdictional emergency management acts or guidelines that emphasize preparedness, mitigation, and long-term sustainability. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on immediate response capabilities without considering long-term mitigation or preparedness fails to meet the comprehensive mandate of emergency management. This could lead to a reactive posture, increasing vulnerability to future events, and potentially violating regulatory requirements that mandate a balanced approach to all phases of the emergency management cycle. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes highly visible, but less impactful, preparedness measures over essential infrastructure resilience would be ethically questionable, as it could misallocate resources and leave critical systems exposed. This would represent a failure to exercise due diligence and a potential breach of professional responsibility to safeguard essential services. A third incorrect approach that neglects community engagement and stakeholder input in favor of top-down decision-making undermines the collaborative nature of effective emergency management and can lead to plans that are not culturally appropriate or practically implementable, potentially violating principles of equitable preparedness and response. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough risk assessment, considering all potential hazards and their impacts. This should be followed by an evaluation of existing capabilities and resource gaps, informed by data and expert analysis. Strategic objectives should then be developed, balancing immediate needs with long-term goals. Resource allocation decisions should be transparent, justifiable, and aligned with these objectives and regulatory mandates. Continuous evaluation and adaptation are crucial to ensure ongoing effectiveness and compliance. Question 6. Quality control measures reveal that during a recent widespread severe weather event, the local emergency alert system, EASE, broadcast was significantly delayed in reaching a substantial portion of the affected population, and social media channels were flooded with unverified and conflicting information. As the professional emergency manager, what is the most appropriate immediate strategic adjustment to improve public warning and information dissemination for future events of this magnitude? Option A. Increase the frequency of EAS broadcasts to ensure the message is heard, and direct all public information dissemination efforts solely through official government social media accounts to control the narrative. Option B. Expand the use of outdoor siren systems to cover all populated areas and encourage residents to share information amongst themselves via personal communication networks. Option C. Focus all resources on upgrading the primary EAS infrastructure to ensure faster broadcast times, and advise the public to rely on official government websites for all information. Option D. Implement a multi-channel notification strategy that integrates EAS with redundant systems like reverse 911, targeted mobile alerts, and partnerships with local media for broadcast, while establishing a clear protocol for verifying all public information before dissemination and actively monitoring social media for misinformation to provide timely corrections. The correct answer is D. Implement a multi-channel notification strategy that integrates EAS with redundant systems like reverse 911, targeted mobile alerts, and partnerships with local media for broadcast, while establishing a clear protocol for verifying all public information before dissemination and actively monitoring social media for misinformation to provide timely corrections. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a multifaceted approach to communication during a rapidly evolving disaster, balancing the need for immediate public safety with the complexities of technological limitations and diverse stakeholder needs. The professional emergency manager must navigate the critical intersection of warning dissemination, public information, and the underlying communication infrastructure, all while adhering to established protocols and ethical obligations. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a layered and integrated communication strategy that leverages multiple channels and addresses the specific needs of vulnerable populations. This aligns with the principles of effective crisis communication, emphasizing timeliness, accuracy, accessibility, and transparency. It also implicitly acknowledges the importance of interoperability and redundancy in communication systems, a cornerstone of disaster preparedness and response, as mandated by various emergency management frameworks that stress the need for robust and resilient communication capabilities. The focus on verifying information before dissemination and tailoring messages to different audiences are key ethical and practical considerations in public information dissemination. Incorrect approaches fail by either over-relying on a single communication method, neglecting critical infrastructure vulnerabilities, or demonstrating a lack of understanding regarding the diverse needs of the public during a crisis. Over-reliance on a single system, such as social media, ignores the digital divide and the potential for misinformation, failing to meet the ethical obligation to reach all segments of the population. Neglecting to confirm information before broadcasting it risks spreading panic and distrust, a direct violation of public information dissemination, best practices, and potentially regulatory requirements for accuracy. Failing to consider the needs of individuals with disabilities or those without access to specific technologies represents a failure in equitable communication and preparedness, which is often a regulatory and ethical imperative. Professional decision-making in such situations should follow a framework that begins with a rapid assessment of the situation and the immediate communication needs. This involves identifying the most effective and accessible warning and notification systems available, considering the nature of the threat and the affected population. Simultaneously, the emergency manager must activate public information dissemination strategies, ensuring messages are clear, concise, and actionable. A critical step is to establish mechanisms for verifying information and monitoring feedback, allowing for adjustments to the communication strategy as the situation evolves. Finally, continuous evaluation of communication effectiveness and coordination with all relevant stakeholders, including media and community organizations, is essential for a comprehensive and successful response. Question 7. The monitoring system demonstrates that, while a significant number of temporary housing units have been deployed, the long-term housing recovery plan lacks specific strategies for integrating updated hazard mitigation measures into the reconstruction of permanent housing stock, and there is a noticeable gap in the coordination between housing repair efforts and the implementation of updated building codes in flood-prone areas. Which of the following approaches best addresses this implementation challenge within the U.S. regulatory framework for disaster recovery? Option A. Focus resources on stimulating local businesses and attracting new investment to the affected region, with the expectation that economic growth will indirectly fund future housing improvements and mitigation efforts as they become financially feasible. Option B. Accelerate the deployment of additional temporary housing solutions and initiate a public awareness campaign about the availability of housing assistance, deferring detailed hazard mitigation planning for permanent housing until after the immediate shelter needs are fully met. Option C. Revise the long-term housing recovery plan to include a phased approach for permanent housing reconstruction that prioritizes areas with lower hazard risk, mandates the elevation or flood-proofing of all new and substantially improved structures in identified flood zones, and establishes a clear funding mechanism for mitigation-related upgrades beyond minimum code requirements, ensuring alignment with FEMA hazard mitigation assistance programs. Option D. Initiate a comprehensive environmental remediation program for all affected areas, prioritizing the cleanup of contaminated sites, and then develop a separate housing recovery plan that addresses structural repairs and new construction without explicit integration of hazard mitigation. The correct answer is C. Revise the long-term housing recovery plan to include a phased approach for permanent housing reconstruction that prioritizes areas with lower hazard risk, mandates the elevation or flood-proofing of all new and substantially improved structures in identified flood zones, and establishes a clear funding mechanism for mitigation-related upgrades beyond minimum code requirements, ensuring alignment with FEMA hazard mitigation assistance programs. Explanation. This scenario presents a significant implementation challenge in long-term disaster recovery, specifically concerning housing recovery and community rebuilding, within the context of U.S. federal regulations governing disaster assistance and housing programs. The core difficulty lies in balancing the immediate need for shelter with the long-term goal of resilient and equitable community development, while adhering to complex funding streams and regulatory requirements. The monitoring system's findings highlight a potential disconnect between immediate relief efforts and the strategic integration of hazard mitigation into the recovery process, which is a critical component of sustainable rebuilding as mandated by various federal programs. The correct approach, which focuses on integrating hazard mitigation principles into the development of a comprehensive long-term housing recovery plan, represents best professional practice. This aligns with the overarching goals of federal disaster recovery legislation, such as the Robert T. Stafford Disaster Relief and Emergency Assistance Act, Stafford Act, and related housing policies administered by agencies like the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD. By proactively incorporating mitigation measures into housing reconstruction and community planning, emergency managers ensure that future development is less vulnerable to recurring hazards, thereby reducing long-term costs and improving community resilience. This approach also addresses the ethical imperative to build back better and more equitably, ensuring that vulnerable populations are not disproportionately impacted by future events. An incorrect approach that prioritizes rapid housing unit deployment without adequate consideration for long-term resilience and hazard mitigation fails to meet regulatory expectations and ethical standards. This could lead to the reconstruction of housing in areas still prone to significant risk, necessitating future disaster response and potentially violating principles of responsible land use and development. Such an approach might also overlook opportunities to integrate updated building codes or elevate structures, which are often conditions for federal funding and are crucial for long-term sustainability. Another incorrect approach that focuses solely on economic recovery without a parallel, integrated housing recovery plan risks creating a fragmented and less effective overall recovery. While economic revitalization is vital, it cannot be fully realized if a significant portion of the population lacks stable, safe, and resilient housing. This disconnect can exacerbate social inequities and hinder the community's ability to attract and retain businesses and residents. Ethically, it fails to address the fundamental need for shelter as a prerequisite for broader community well-being. A third incorrect approach that emphasizes environmental remediation as a standalone priority, detached from housing and infrastructure recovery, also represents a failure in integrated planning. While environmental cleanup is essential, it must be coordinated with housing and infrastructure repair to ensure that rebuilt areas are not only safe from environmental hazards, but also functional and habitable. Neglecting the interconnectedness of these recovery elements can lead to inefficient resource allocation and a recovery that does not fully address the multifaceted needs of the affected community. This can also lead to regulatory noncompliance if environmental remediation efforts are not aligned with broader land use and development plans. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a robust stakeholder engagement process, a thorough risk assessment that informs mitigation strategies, and the development of a unified long-term recovery plan that explicitly integrates housing, infrastructure, economic, environmental, and social service components. Professionals must continuously refer to relevant federal regulations and guidance, such as FEMA National Disaster Recovery Framework, NDRF, and HUD's disaster recovery programs, to ensure compliance and best practices. The focus should always be on building a more resilient and equitable future, not just restoring the pre-disaster status quo. Question 8. The assessment process reveals that during a recent large-scale wildfire event, emergency management personnel made rapid decisions regarding the allocation of limited shelter space and transportation resources. While the primary goal was to evacuate the maximum number of individuals from immediate danger, concerns have been raised regarding whether certain demographic groups received preferential treatment in the allocation of these resources, and whether the privacy of individuals seeking shelter was adequately protected during the registration process. Which of the following approaches best reflects the legal and ethical considerations that should guide emergency management actions in such a scenario, adhering to the principles of the Professional Emergency Manager, PEM, certification? Option A. Focus on evacuating the most vulnerable populations first, as determined by pre-existing social service records, and share collected personal data with partner agencies to streamline recovery efforts. Option B. Implement a resource allocation strategy that considers the urgency of evacuation needs for all affected populations equally, ensuring that no group is unfairly disadvantaged, and establish clear protocols for data privacy and confidentiality throughout the registration and sheltering process. Option C. Expedite the registration process by collecting only essential contact information and allocate shelter space based on the order in which individuals arrive at designated evacuation points. Option D. Prioritize immediate evacuation and sheltering based solely on proximity to the hazard, while ensuring all collected personal data is securely stored and accessed only by authorized personnel for immediate response needs. The correct answer is D. Prioritize immediate evacuation and sheltering based solely on proximity to the hazard, while ensuring all collected personal data is securely stored and accessed only by authorized personnel for immediate response needs. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common yet complex challenge in emergency management, balancing the immediate need for public safety during a disaster with the protection of individual civil rights and liberties. The rapid deployment of resources, particularly in the context of evacuation and sheltering, can inadvertently lead to situations where individuals' rights to privacy, freedom of movement, and non-discrimination are compromised. The professional challenge lies in ensuring that emergency response actions, while swift and effective, are also legally sound and ethically defensible, adhering to established frameworks that govern emergency powers and individual protections. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach emphasizes a proactive and informed understanding of legal frameworks governing emergency management, specifically focusing on the intersection of disaster response and civil rights. This involves consulting relevant federal, state, and local laws, including those related to emergency declarations, evacuation orders, and the establishment of shelters. It also necessitates a deep understanding of ethical principles, such as justice, fairness, and respect for human dignity, which guide decision-making when resources are scarce and difficult choices must be made. By prioritizing legal compliance and ethical considerations, emergency managers ensure that actions taken are not only effective in mitigating harm, but also uphold the fundamental rights of all affected individuals, thereby fostering public trust and minimizing potential legal challenges. This approach aligns with the professional emergency manager PEM certification's emphasis on comprehensive knowledge of legal and ethical responsibilities. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach fails to adequately consider the legal ramifications of resource allocation during an emergency. This could manifest as prioritizing certain populations for limited resources without a clear, non-discriminatory legal or ethical justification, potentially violating equal protection clauses or anti-discrimination statutes. Such an approach risks legal challenges and erodes public confidence. Another incorrect approach overlooks the privacy implications of data collection and sharing during an emergency. Emergency managers have a responsibility to protect sensitive personal information gathered for response and recovery efforts. Failing to implement robust privacy protocols, such as unauthorized disclosure of medical information or contact details, can lead to significant legal liabilities under privacy laws and ethical breaches of trust. A third incorrect approach neglects the specific legal requirements and ethical considerations surrounding evacuation and sheltering. This might involve issuing evacuation orders without proper legal authority, failing to provide accessible shelter options for individuals with disabilities or specific needs, or imposing arbitrary restrictions on shelter access. Such actions can violate statutory mandates for emergency preparedness and response, as well as fundamental ethical obligations to protect vulnerable populations. Professional reasoning. Emergency managers should adopt a decision-making process that begins with a thorough understanding of the applicable legal and regulatory landscape at all levels of government. This includes identifying the specific authorities granted during emergencies and the corresponding limitations designed to protect civil rights and liberties. Ethical principles should then be integrated into the decision-making framework, guiding the equitable distribution of resources and the fair treatment of all individuals. When faced with complex choices, professionals should consult legal counsel, seek guidance from ethical review boards if available, and prioritize transparency and accountability in their actions. A continuous commitment to training and education on legal and ethical best practices is crucial for navigating the dynamic challenges of emergency management. Question 9. System analysis indicates that during a multi-jurisdictional wildfire response, the professional emergency manager, PEM, is faced with conflicting demands from a federal land management agency prioritizing resource preservation, a state emergency management agency focused on immediate public evacuation, and a local community group advocating for the protection of specific cultural sites. The PEM must lead a diverse team of responders from various agencies and volunteer organizations. Which leadership and management approach best addresses the immediate crisis while upholding professional and regulatory obligations? Option A. Implement a unified command structure that actively engages all key stakeholders in collaborative decision-making, clearly delegates responsibilities based on expertise, and establishes transparent communication channels to address competing priorities and ensure equitable resource allocation. Option B. Adopt a directive leadership style, prioritizing the immediate evacuation orders from the state agency as the most critical task, and deferring discussions on resource preservation and cultural site protection until the immediate threat to life is resolved. Option C. Focus solely on the directives from the Federal Land Management Agency, as their mandate often involves long-term ecological impacts, and delegate the management of public evacuation and community concerns to lower-level personnel to avoid direct conflict. Option D. Establish a separate task force to address the community group's concerns independently, while the primary response team focuses on the federal and state agency directives, thereby compartmentalizing the issues to prevent further complication. Correct answer is A. Implement a unified command structure that actively engages all key stakeholders in collaborative decision-making, clearly delegates responsibilities based on expertise, and establishes transparent communication channels to address competing priorities and ensure equitable resource allocation. Explanation. This scenario presents a significant challenge for a professional emergency manager, PEM, due to the inherent complexities of leading a diverse team under extreme duress, while simultaneously navigating the expectations of multiple, potentially conflicting stakeholder groups. The core difficulty lies in balancing the immediate operational needs of the emergency response with the long-term strategic interests and communication requirements of various entities, including government agencies, private sector partners, and the affected public. Effective leadership in such a context demands not only technical competence in emergency management, but also sophisticated interpersonal skills, ethical judgment, and a deep understanding of the regulatory framework governing emergency response. The correct approach emphasizes a collaborative and transparent leadership style, prioritizing clear communication and shared decision-making with key stakeholders. This aligns with best professional practices for emergency management, which are often underpinned by principles of good governance, accountability, and public trust. Specifically, in the U.S. regulatory framework, this approach resonates with the National Incident Management System, NIMS principles, which advocate for standardized incident command structures, unified command, and interagency coordination. Furthermore, ethical guidelines for emergency managers, such as those promoted by professional organizations, stress the importance of stakeholder engagement, equitable resource allocation, and transparent communication to ensure public safety and confidence. Empowering the team and delegating responsibilities appropriately, while maintaining oversight, fosters a more resilient and effective response, directly addressing the PEM's responsibility for personnel management and development. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on top-down directive leadership without adequate stakeholder consultation would fail to leverage the expertise and resources of all involved parties. This could lead to misaligned efforts, resistance from stakeholders, and ultimately, a less effective response. Ethically, this approach risks alienating key partners and undermining public trust, violating principles of collaboration and shared responsibility. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes the demands of one dominant stakeholder group over others, without a balanced consideration of the overall emergency and the needs of all affected parties, would be a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This could lead to inequitable distribution of resources, perceived favoritism, and potential legal challenges. It neglects the PEM's duty to act in the best interest of the entire community and to adhere to established emergency management protocols that mandate broad coordination. A third incorrect approach that avoids difficult conversations and conflict resolution, opting instead for a passive stance, would be detrimental. This failure to address inter-team or interagency friction can paralyze decision-making and hinder operational effectiveness, violating the PEM's responsibility for team management and conflict resolution, and potentially leading to a breakdown in command and control, which has direct regulatory implications under emergency management statutes. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough situational assessment, identifying immediate needs and potential risks. This should be followed by an inclusive stakeholder analysis to understand their perspectives, capabilities, and concerns. The PEM should then leverage established incident command structures and communication protocols to facilitate collaborative problem-solving and decision-making. Delegation of tasks based on expertise and empowerment of team members, coupled with regular performance feedback, are crucial for maintaining morale and operational efficiency. Continuous communication, both within the response team and with external stakeholders, is paramount to building trust and ensuring a coordinated and effective outcome. Question 10. Assessment of a coastal community's disaster preparedness plan reveals a significant reliance on historical hurricane data for hazard identification, with limited consideration for other potential threats like tsunamis or cyber attacks. The vulnerability assessment primarily focuses on population density in evacuation zones, overlooking the resilience of critical infrastructure such as power grids and water treatment facilities. The risk analysis section is rudimentary, lacking a clear methodology for assessing the probability and consequence of identified hazards. Consequently, the proposed mitigation strategies are narrowly focused on evacuation procedures, with minimal integration of infrastructure hardening or community-wide resilience measures. Which of the following approaches best represents a professionally sound and regulatory compliant methodology for improving this community's disaster preparedness? Option A. Expand the historical data analysis to include a wider range of past events, such as severe storms and localized flooding, and enhance the population vulnerability assessment by mapping demographic data within identified hazard zones. Option B. Implement a multi-hazard identification process incorporating historical data, expert elicitation, and scenario-based planning for natural, technological, and human-caused threats. Simultaneously, conduct a comprehensive vulnerability assessment of population, critical infrastructure, and environmental assets. Follow this with a structured risk analysis using probability and consequence modeling, culminating in mitigation planning that directly addresses identified risks and vulnerabilities. Option C. Focus mitigation efforts on strengthening the community's emergency response capabilities, including increasing the number of trained first responders and acquiring additional emergency equipment, without significantly altering the current hazard identification and risk assessment processes. Option D. Prioritize the development of a robust public awareness campaign about hurricane risks, utilizing the existing evacuation zone maps, and allocate resources towards improving communication channel for emergency alerts. The correct answer is B. Implement a multi-hazard identification process incorporating historical data, expert elicitation, and scenario-based planning for natural, technological, and human-caused threats. Simultaneously, conduct a comprehensive vulnerability assessment of population, critical infrastructure, and environmental assets. Follow this with a structured risk analysis using probability and consequence modeling, culminating in mitigation planning that directly addresses identified risks and vulnerabilities. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge for professional emergency managers, PEM, in the United States, effectively integrating diverse hazard identification and risk assessment methodologies into a comprehensive mitigation plan, while adhering to federal guidelines. The core difficulty lies in balancing the strengths and weaknesses of different approaches to ensure all potential risks are identified and prioritized appropriately, leading to robust and actionable mitigation strategies. The professional challenge is to move beyond a superficial application of tools to a deep understanding of how each contributes to the overall risk picture, and how this informs strategic decision-making under resource constraints. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it demonstrates a systematic and comprehensive application of established risk management principles aligned with U.S. federal disaster preparedness frameworks, such as those outlined by FEMA. This approach prioritizes a multifaceted hazard identification process that leverages both qualitative and quantitative data. It acknowledges the importance of understanding the full spectrum of potential threats, from natural hazards to human-caused events, and then systematically assesses the vulnerability of critical infrastructure, population demographics, and the environment. The subsequent risk analysis, employing techniques like probability and consequence assessment, allows for clear prioritization of risks, often visualized through a risk matrix. Crucially, this approach emphasizes the integration of these findings directly into mitigation planning, ensuring that preparedness efforts are targeted and effective. This aligns with the ethical imperative of PEMs to protect public safety and welfare by making informed, evidence-based decisions. An incorrect approach that relies solely on historical data analysis for hazard identification would be professionally unacceptable. While historical data is valuable, it is insufficient on its own. It fails to account for emerging threats, changes in environmental conditions, or the potential for novel hazard scenarios not previously experienced. This represents a regulatory failure by not adhering to the comprehensive hazard identification requirements often mandated by federal programs that encourage a forward-looking perspective. Ethically, it risks leaving communities vulnerable to unforeseen dangers. Another incorrect approach that focuses exclusively on population vulnerability, without a thorough hazard identification and infrastructure assessment, would also be a significant failure. While understanding population susceptibility is vital, it must be contextualized within the specific hazards a community faces and the resilience of its infrastructure. This approach neglects the foundational steps of risk assessment, leading to mitigation plans that may not address the root causes of potential damage or the cascading effects of a disaster. This is a regulatory failure as it bypasses essential components of a comprehensive risk assessment process. Ethically, it could lead to misallocation of resources and ineffective protection strategies. Finally, an approach that prioritizes risk communication before a thorough risk analysis is completed is also flawed. While effective communication is critical for preparedness, communicating incomplete or poorly analyzed risk information can lead to public confusion, distrust, and ineffective response. A professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured, iterative approach. It begins with a broad hazard identification, followed by detailed vulnerability and risk assessments. Only after a clear understanding of the risks, their probabilities and consequences, should robust risk communication strategies be developed and implemented. This ensures that information shared with stakeholders is accurate, actionable, and supports informed decision-making and preparedness actions. This systematic process is essential for fulfilling the PEM's responsibility to provide reliable guidance and foster community resilience. Question 11. Comparative studies suggest that the effectiveness of hurricane preparedness and evacuation strategies can be significantly influenced by the timing and scope of protective actions. Considering a Category 3 hurricane forecast to make landfall within 48-72 hours, with a projected track that could impact a broad coastal region and potentially inland areas with heavy rainfall and wind, which of the following approaches best optimizes the balance between public safety and resource management for an emergency manager operating under U.S. federal regulations? Option A. Delay any evacuation orders until the hurricane is within 24 hours of landfall, focusing only on immediate coastal threats to avoid unnecessary disruption. Option B. Initiate a phased evacuation for the most vulnerable coastal zones and low-lying areas, with clear communication about potential expansion based on updated forecasts, while simultaneously preparing inland shelters and staging resources for potential inland flooding and wind damage response. Option C. Issue a mandatory, full-scale evacuation order for the entire coastal region immediately, regardless of the storm's precise track or potential for weakening, to ensure maximum public safety. Option D. Implement a targeted evacuation solely for the immediate coastal strip, assuming inland areas will not be significantly affected by a Category 3 storm. The correct answer is B. Initiate a phased evacuation for the most vulnerable coastal zones and low-lying areas, with clear communication about potential expansion based on updated forecasts, while simultaneously preparing inland shelters and staging resources for potential inland flooding and wind damage response. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a significant challenge for an emergency manager due to the inherent uncertainties in hurricane forecasting and the complex, multi-jurisdictional nature of evacuation planning. The need to balance public safety with potential economic disruption, resource allocation, and the varying capacities of different communities requires sophisticated judgment. The dynamic nature of hurricane intensity and track, coupled with the potential for rapid shifts, necessitates a flexible and adaptive approach to preparedness and response. Furthermore, ensuring equitable access to resources and information for all segments of the population, particularly vulnerable groups, adds another layer of complexity. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach, which emphasizes a phased evacuation strategy informed by real-time meteorological data and pre-established vulnerability assessments, represents best professional practice. This aligns with the principles of the National Response Framework, NRF, and the National Incident Management System, NIMS, in the United States, which advocate for a coordinated, scalable, and flexible approach to incident management. Specifically, it reflects the guidance within FEMA Hazard Mitigation Planning Handbook and the Disaster Mitigation Act of 2000, which mandate the development of comprehensive mitigation and preparedness plans that consider all hazards, including hurricanes. This approach prioritizes life safety by initiating evacuation procedures based on credible threat assessments, while also optimizing resource deployment by avoiding unnecessary or premature evacuations that could strain resources and public trust. The integration of real-time data ensures that decisions are evidence-based and responsive to the evolving threat, a core tenet of effective emergency management. Incorrect approaches analysis. Initiating a mandatory, full-scale evacuation for the entire coastal region solely based on a Category 3 forecast, without considering the storm's projected track or potential for weakening, represents a failure to adhere to principles of proportionality and resource optimization. This approach could lead to unnecessary disruption, economic loss, and a depletion of resources that might be critically needed for a more targeted response if the storm's trajectory shifts. Ethically, it could be seen as an overreaction that erodes public confidence in emergency management. Delaying any evacuation orders until the hurricane is within 24 hours of landfall, regardless of the forecast intensity and projected impact zone, is a critical regulatory and ethical failure. This directly contravenes the NRF and NIMS' emphasis on proactive preparedness and timely protective actions. Such a delay ignores the lead time required for effective evacuation, particularly for vulnerable populations, and significantly increases the risk to life and property. It demonstrates a lack of foresight and a failure to adequately assess and communicate risk, violating the ethical obligation to protect the public. Focusing exclusively on the immediate coastal strip for evacuation, while disregarding inland areas that may be susceptible to severe flooding and wind damage from a Category 3 storm, is a flawed approach. This demonstrates a lack of comprehensive hazard-specific knowledge regarding the full spectrum of hurricane impacts, which extend beyond storm surge. It fails to meet the regulatory requirement for a holistic risk assessment and preparedness plan that considers all potential consequences of a hurricane, including inland flooding and wind damage, thereby jeopardizing the safety of a significant portion of the population. Professional reasoning. Emergency managers should employ a decision-making framework that integrates continuous risk assessment, scenario planning, and adaptive management. This involves 1. Monitoring meteorological forecasts and advisories from authoritative sources like the National Hurricane Center. 2. Activating predefined evacuation triggers based on storm category, projected track, speed, and potential impacts, storm surge, wind, inland flooding. 3. Conducting vulnerability assessments to identify populations requiring special assistance and tailoring evacuation plans accordingly. 4. Coordinating with all relevant stakeholders, including local, state, and federal agencies, as well as non-governmental organizations. 5. Communicating clear, consistent, and actionable information to the public. 6. Maintaining flexibility to adjust plans and actions as the situation evolves. This systematic and adaptive approach ensures that decisions are informed, timely, and prioritize the safety and well-being of the affected population while optimizing the use of available resources. Question 12. Process analysis reveals that following a major disaster, an emergency manager is responsible for coordinating the financial recovery efforts across multiple federal programs and private insurance. To ensure the most effective and compliant financial management, which of the following approaches best aligns with regulatory requirements and professional best practices for disaster recovery? Option A. Delay the reconciliation of insurance claims with FEMA assistance applications until all FEMA funds have been fully disbursed, operating under the assumption that insurance will ultimately cover any overpayments made by FEMA. Option B. Bypass established internal controls for grant management and financial tracking to expedite the recovery process, focusing solely on securing the maximum possible funding from all available sources without detailed oversight. Option C. Implement a comprehensive financial tracking system that meticulously documents all expenditures against approved budgets for both FEMA public assistance and individual assistance programs, proactively reconcile insurance settlements to prevent duplication of benefits, and maintain rigorous grant management protocols with a strong emphasis on fraud prevention. Option D. Prioritize the immediate disbursement of available funds to affected individuals and entities, without establishing detailed expenditure tracking for FEMA public assistance and individual assistance programs, assuming that subsequent audits will rectify any discrepancies. The correct answer is C. Implement a comprehensive financial tracking system that meticulously documents all expenditures against approved budgets for both FEMA public assistance and individual assistance programs. Proactively reconcile insurance settlements to prevent duplication of benefits, and maintain rigorous grant management protocols with a strong emphasis on fraud prevention. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a thorough understanding of multiple, often overlapping, financial recovery streams following a disaster. The emergency manager must navigate the complexities of federal grant programs, FEMA PA and IA, private insurance settlements, and internal budgeting, all while ensuring compliance with stringent federal regulations and preventing fraudulent activities. The pressure to quickly secure funds for recovery can lead to rushed decisions, potentially compromising accuracy and compliance. Balancing the need for speed with the imperative for meticulous financial management and fraud prevention is a core professional challenge. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach emphasizes a systematic, integrated financial management strategy that prioritizes regulatory compliance and fraud prevention. This involves establishing clear internal controls for tracking all expenditures against approved budgets for both FEMA public assistance and individual assistance programs. It also necessitates proactive engagement with insurance providers to ensure that insurance proceeds are accurately accounted for and that there is no duplication of benefits. A robust grant management system that meticulously documents all financial transactions, supports grant application, and facilitates audits is crucial. This approach aligns with FEMA regulations, which mandate strict financial accountability, proper documentation, and the prevention of duplicate benefits. It also reflects best practices in grant management and disaster recovery finance, ensuring that funds are used effectively and ethically to support community resilience. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves prioritizing the immediate disbursement of funds without establishing a robust tracking mechanism for FEMA public assistance and individual assistance programs. This failure to implement proper budgeting and financial tracking directly violates FEMA regulations requiring detailed accounting of all awarded funds. It significantly increases the risk of misallocation, overspending, and potential audit findings, jeopardizing future funding. Furthermore, it creates an environment where fraud is more likely to occur due to a lack of oversight. Another incorrect approach is to delay the reconciliation of insurance claims with FEMA assistance applications, assuming that insurance will cover all losses. This can lead to a duplication of benefits, a direct violation of federal law and FEMA policy. FEMA assistance is intended to supplement, not replace, insurance coverage. Failing to reconcile these streams promptly can result in ineligible claims, repayment obligations, and penalties. It also demonstrates a lack of due diligence in financial management and a disregard for the principles of equitable recovery. A third incorrect approach is to bypass established internal controls for grant management and financial tracking in an effort to expedite recovery. This disregard for established procedures, while seemingly efficient in the short term, undermines the integrity of the financial recovery process. It increases the likelihood of errors, omissions, and potential fraud, making the organization vulnerable to audits and sanctions. It also fails to build a sustainable financial management framework for future disasters. Professional reasoning. Emergency managers should adopt a decision-making framework that begins with a comprehensive understanding of all applicable federal regulations, particularly those governing FEMA public assistance and individual assistance programs. This includes a thorough review of grant management guidelines and fraud prevention protocols. The next step is to develop and implement a detailed financial management plan that integrates all recovery funding streams, including insurance. This plan should establish clear lines of responsibility, robust tracking mechanisms, and regular reconciliation procedures. Proactive communication with all stakeholders, including FEMA, insurance companies, and internal departments, is essential. Finally, continuous monitoring and auditing of financial activities are critical to ensure ongoing compliance and to identify and mitigate any potential risks, including fraud. Question 13. To address the challenge of a credible terrorist threat involving a potential CBRNE agent release in a densely populated urban area, what is the most appropriate initial course of action for a professional emergency manager to recommend to the Unified Command? Option A. Advise the Unified Command to prioritize the immediate evacuation of all residents within a 5-mile radius of the suspected release point to minimize potential exposure, regardless of specific agent identification. Option B. Suggest that the Unified Command focus on establishing communication channels with the public to reassure them and advise them to remain vigilant, while deferring the activation of specialized response assets until law enforcement confirms the terrorist nature of the incident. Option C. Recommend the deployment of hazmat teams to conduct widespread environmental sampling across the entire city to identify the agent before any public protective actions are considered. Option D. Immediately recommend the activation of the regional CBRNE response teams. Establish a secure perimeter around the suspected release zone based on initial intelligence, and initiate public notification protocols for voluntary sheltering in place while awaiting further intelligence on the specific agent and its dispersal. The correct answer is D. Immediately recommend the activation of the regional CBRNE response teams. Establish a secure perimeter around the suspected release zone based on initial intelligence, and initiate public notification protocols for voluntary sheltering in place while awaiting further intelligence on the specific agent and its dispersal. Explanation. This scenario presents a significant professional challenge for an emergency manager due to the inherent uncertainty, rapid escalation potential, and the need for immediate, coordinated action in a high-consequence event. The presence of a credible terrorist threat involving a CBRNE agent necessitates a response that balances public safety with the preservation of critical infrastructure and resources, all while adhering to strict legal and ethical mandates. The complexity arises from the need to integrate intelligence, public health, law enforcement, and emergency response capabilities under extreme pressure. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a multi-agency, intelligence-led response that aligns with established national preparedness frameworks and CBRNE response protocols. This approach emphasizes the systematic identification and mitigation of immediate threats, the establishment of clear command and control structures, and the implementation of evidence-based public protective action. Adherence to the National Incident Management System, NIMS, and relevant Department of Homeland Security, DHS, guidelines ensures a standardized, interoperable, and effective response, minimizing confusion and maximizing resource utilization. Ethical considerations, such as the duty to protect the public and the principle of proportionality in protective actions, are implicitly addressed by this structured and informed methodology. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on immediate evacuation without confirmed intelligence or a clear understanding of the agent's dispersal pattern would be a regulatory and ethical failure. This would constitute an overreaction, potentially causing widespread panic, unnecessary disruption, and the misallocation of critical resources, violating principles of responsible emergency management, and potentially exceeding the authority granted by emergency declarations without sufficient justification. Another incorrect approach, such as initiating decontamination procedures for the general public without a confirmed release or exposure, would also represent a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This action would be premature, resource-intensive, and could lead to unnecessary public anxiety and distrust in emergency services. It fails to adhere to the principle of evidence-based response and could violate privacy and civil liberties if implemented without proper cause. A third incorrect approach, which involves delaying the activation of specialized CBRNE response teams pending further confirmation from multiple independent sources, would be a critical failure in professional decision-making. In a suspected CBRNE event, time is of the essence. Delays in mobilizing specialized assets can have catastrophic consequences, leading to increased casualties and a more widespread and difficult-to-contain incident. This approach neglects the urgency inherent in such threats and the importance of proactive, albeit cautious, preparedness measures. The professional reasoning process for this situation should involve a rapid assessment of the threat based on available intelligence, followed by the immediate activation of the incident command system. Key decision points include determining the appropriate level of alert, initiating communication protocols with relevant agencies, and evaluating the need for immediate public protective actions based on the nature and potential spread of the threat. This process requires a thorough understanding of CBRNE hazards, established response protocols, and the legal authorities available to emergency managers. Question 14. Cost-benefit analysis shows that a proposed flood barrier project offers a high return on investment, but community leaders express concerns about its visual impact and potential disruption to local businesses during construction. Simultaneously, a non-structural mitigation strategy involving widespread elevation of existing homes has a lower, but still positive, benefit-cost ratio and is favored by many residents for its perceived minimal disruption. As a professional emergency manager, PEM, operating under U.S. federal regulations, which approach best aligns with the principles of effective hazard mitigation planning and grant program requirements. Option A. Prioritize the flood barrier project due to its superior cost-benefit ratio, while developing a robust communication plan to address community concerns and a detailed construction management plan to minimize business disruption. Option B. Recommend deferring mitigation efforts until a consensus can be reached on a project with no perceived negative impacts, regardless of the cost-benefit analysis or urgency of the hazard. Option C. Focus solely on ensuring all existing structures meet current building codes and standards, as this is the most direct way to address structural vulnerabilities identified in the hazard assessment. Option D. Select the non-structural mitigation strategy of elevating homes, as it has higher community acceptance and perceived lower disruption, even with a less favorable benefit-cost ratio. The correct answer is A. Prioritize the flood barrier project due to its superior cost-benefit ratio, while developing a robust communication plan to address community concerns and a detailed construction management plan to minimize business disruption. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge for professional emergency managers, PEM, in the United States, specifically concerning the application of hazard mitigation planning under the Robert T. Stafford Disaster Relief and Emergency Assistance Act, Stafford Act, and its implementing regulations, particularly 44 CFR Part 201. The core challenge lies in balancing the demonstrated effectiveness of a mitigation strategy, as indicated by cost-benefit analysis, with the practical realities of implementation, including community buy-in, available funding streams, and adherence to established building codes and standards. A PEM must navigate these complexities to ensure that mitigation efforts are not only theoretically sound, but also practically achievable and legally compliant. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a comprehensive and integrated mitigation planning process that aligns with federal requirements. This involves a thorough hazard identification and vulnerability assessment, followed by the development of clear, measurable goals and actionable strategies. The chosen strategy, while demonstrating a positive benefit-cost ratio, must also be evaluated against its feasibility, sustainability, and potential for broader community impact. Adherence to building codes and standards, as well as consideration of land use planning principles, are critical for ensuring long-term resilience and preventing future losses. Furthermore, leveraging appropriate grant programs, such as the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, HMGP, or the Pre-Disaster Mitigation, PDM program, is essential for securing the necessary funding, and the application process for these grants requires a robust mitigation plan that addresses all these elements. This holistic approach ensures that mitigation efforts are effective, equitable, and sustainable, fulfilling the PEM's ethical and professional obligations. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the highest benefit-cost ratio without considering implementation feasibility or community impact represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure. It neglects the practical requirements of grant programs, which often mandate detailed implementation plans and community engagement. Ethically, it could lead to the selection of a project that is technically superior but politically or socially unviable, wasting resources and failing to achieve actual risk reduction. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes a mitigation strategy solely based on its perceived ease of implementation disregarding a robust cost-benefit analysis or the potential for greater long-term risk reduction, is also professionally unacceptable. This approach fails to meet the spirit and intent of federal mitigation programs, which aim to maximize the return on investment in disaster resilience. Ethically, it could result in suboptimal allocation of limited resources, leaving the community more vulnerable than it needs to be. A third incorrect approach that relies exclusively on existing building codes and standards without proactive hazard mitigation planning demonstrates a reactive rather than a proactive stance. While building codes are crucial for new construction and renovations, they do not inherently address existing vulnerabilities or the specific risks identified through a comprehensive hazard mitigation plan. This approach fails to leverage federal funding opportunities designed for proactive mitigation and may not adequately protect against the most significant identified hazards. Ethically, it represents a missed opportunity to enhance community safety and resilience beyond minimum compliance. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. 1. Thoroughly understand the regulatory framework, Stafford Act, 44 CFR Part 201 FEMA guidance. 2. Conduct a comprehensive hazard identification and vulnerability assessment. 3. Engage stakeholders, including community members, local officials, and private sector partners throughout the planning process. 4. Develop clear, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound, SMART mitigation goals. 5. Identify and evaluate a range of mitigation strategies, considering their technical feasibility, cost-effectiveness, including benefit-cost analysis, environmental impact, and social equity. 6. Prioritize strategies based on a balanced assessment of these factors, aligning with community needs and available resources. 7. Develop a detailed implementation plan, including funding strategies, timelines, and responsible parties. 8. Continuously monitor and evaluate the effectiveness of implemented mitigation measures and adapt the plan as necessary. Question 15. Stakeholder feedback indicates a perceived disconnect between the organization's immediate disaster response capabilities and its long-term ability to maintain essential functions during and after a significant disruptive event. Considering the principles of comprehensive emergency management planning, CEMP, the integration of NIMS and SEMS, and the importance of continuity of operations planning, COOP, and business continuity planning, BCP, which approach best addresses this feedback and strengthens the organization's overall resilience. Option A. Finalize the existing EOP documentation and conduct a single, comprehensive COOP exercise once every 5 years to ensure compliance with basic continuity requirements. Option B. Enhance the technical communication and logistics sections of the EOP to improve immediate response efficiency, assuming that business continuity will be addressed by individual departments as a secondary concern. Option C. Proactively integrate COOP and BCP principles directly into the Emergency Operations Plan (EOP) framework, ensuring that the EOP development process includes a thorough assessment of essential functions, resource requirements for continuity, and establishes a clear schedule for regular testing, training, and plan updates. Option D. Develop a separate, standalone COOP plan that is activated only after the immediate incident response phase is deemed complete, focusing on restoring essential functions without direct integration into the EOP. The correct answer is C. Proactively integrate COOP and BCP principles directly into the Emergency Operations Plan (EOP) framework, ensuring that the EOP development process includes a thorough assessment of essential functions, resource requirements for continuity, and establishes a clear schedule for regular testing, training, and plan updates. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the immediate need for effective incident response with the long-term strategic imperative of maintaining organizational resilience. The tension lies in prioritizing immediate operational needs during a crisis versus investing in the proactive planning and maintenance necessary for future continuity. A professional emergency manager must demonstrate foresight and the ability to integrate both reactive and proactive planning frameworks. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it acknowledges the interconnectedness of immediate incident management and long-term continuity. By integrating COOP principles into the EOP and ensuring regular testing and updating of both, the organization demonstrates a mature understanding of comprehensive emergency management. This aligns with best practices in disaster preparedness, emphasizing a holistic approach that moves beyond mere response to encompass preparedness, mitigation, and recovery. Specifically, it reflects the principles of NIMS and SEMS by ensuring a coordinated, standardized approach to incident management, while simultaneously addressing the critical need for organizational continuity, as mandated by federal guidelines and professional standards for emergency managers. The emphasis on testing and updating ensures the plan remains relevant and effective, a core tenet of plan maintenance. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach fails by treating COOP as a separate, post-incident concern. This is a regulatory and ethical failure because it neglects the fundamental principle that continuity planning is a proactive measure, not a reactive one. It undermines the comprehensive nature of emergency management by creating a siloed approach, potentially leading to gaps in essential functions during a prolonged or severe event. This also fails to meet the spirit of NIMS and SEMS, which advocate for integrated and coordinated efforts across all phases of emergency management. Another incorrect approach errs by focusing solely on the technical components of the EOP, e.g., communication systems, logistics, without adequately integrating the strategic and human elements of continuity. This is a professional failure, as it overlooks the critical need to maintain essential organizational functions and decision-making capabilities during a disruption. It demonstrates a lack of understanding of the broader implications of a disaster on an organization's ability to operate and recover, which is a core responsibility of a professional emergency manager. This approach also misses the opportunity to leverage COOP principles to enhance the overall effectiveness of the EOP. A further incorrect approach is to consider COOP planning complete once the initial documentation is finalized, without establishing a robust schedule for testing, training, and regular updates. This represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure in plan maintenance. A plan that is not regularly exercised and updated becomes obsolete, rendering it ineffective when needed most. This directly contradicts best practices in emergency management and the requirements for maintaining readiness, as emphasized by NIMS and SEMS, which stress the importance of continuous improvement and validation of plans. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making process that prioritizes a holistic and integrated approach to emergency management. This involves understanding the foundational principles of comprehensive emergency management planning, including hazard analysis, resource assessment, and plan development. Crucially, it requires recognizing the symbiotic relationship between incident response, as outlined in the EOP, guided by NIMS/SEMS, and organizational continuity, COOP/BCP. The decision-making framework should emphasize proactive planning, regular testing and validation, and continuous improvement. Professionals must critically evaluate proposed strategies against these principles, ensuring that all aspects of emergency preparedness and response are addressed in a coordinated and effective manner, thereby fulfilling their ethical and regulatory obligations. Question 16. The evaluation methodology shows that a community is experiencing an increasing frequency and intensity of wildfires due to climate change and land use patterns. To effectively manage this escalating threat, which approach to wildfire risk assessment and mitigation best aligns with the Professional Emergency Manager, PEM, certification requirements and U.S. Federal Emergency Management principles. Option A. Utilizing broad-stroke wildfire risk assessments that apply uniform mitigation strategies across diverse ecological zones within the jurisdiction, without detailed local analysis. Option B. Relying on generalized wildfire behavior models and focusing primarily on immediate suppression capabilities to combat fires once they ignite. Option C. Prioritizing post-wildfire recovery planning and resource allocation, assuming that preparedness measures are less critical than the ability to respond after an event. Option D. Implementing a comprehensive, data-driven wildfire risk assessment that analyzes local fuel types, topography, weather patterns, and historical ignition sources to inform tailored prevention, mitigation, and preparedness strategies. The correct answer is D. Implementing a comprehensive, data-driven wildfire risk assessment that analyzes local fuel types, topography, weather patterns, and historical ignition sources to inform tailored prevention, mitigation, and preparedness strategies. Explanation. The evaluation methodology shows a critical need for emergency managers to understand the nuanced differences in wildfire behavior and risk assessment across diverse geographical and ecological contexts. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a deep understanding of how specific environmental factors, fuel types, topography, and weather patterns interact to influence wildfire ignition, spread, and intensity. A one-size-fits-all approach to wildfire management is inherently flawed and can lead to ineffective resource allocation, inadequate preparedness, and increased risk to life and property. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it emphasizes a data-driven, context-specific assessment of wildfire risk and behavior. This aligns with the core principles of emergency management, which mandate proactive risk reduction and preparedness based on thorough analysis. Specifically, it reflects the guidance found in U.S. federal regulations and FEMA comprehensive all-hazards planning frameworks, which stress the importance of understanding the unique characteristics of each hazard within a given jurisdiction. This includes utilizing local and regional data on fuel loads, historical fire occurrences, weather patterns, and topographical features to inform prevention, mitigation, and preparedness strategies. Ethical considerations also demand that emergency managers prioritize the safety and well-being of the public by employing the most accurate and effective methods available, which necessitates a tailored approach to wildfire management. An incorrect approach that relies solely on generalized wildfire behavior models without considering local conditions fails to meet the professional standard. This is a regulatory failure because it deviates from the requirement for jurisdiction-specific risk assessments mandated by frameworks like the National Preparedness System. Ethically, it is a failure to adequately protect the public by not accounting for the unique vulnerabilities of the community. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes immediate suppression tactics over long-term prevention and mitigation overlooks the fundamental principles of hazard management. This is a failure to adhere to best practices that advocate for a balanced approach, as outlined in FEMA Hazard Mitigation Planning Guidance, which emphasizes reducing the likelihood and impact of disasters. Ethically, this approach can lead to a reactive rather than proactive stance, potentially increasing future risks and costs. A third incorrect approach that focuses exclusively on post-wildfire recovery without robust preparedness measures is a significant professional and regulatory failing. This directly contradicts the all-hazards approach to emergency management, which mandates preparedness and mitigation as foundational elements. Ethically, it demonstrates a lack of foresight and a failure to invest in measures that could prevent or lessen the severity of future events, thereby failing in the duty to protect the community. Professional decision-making in similar situations requires a systematic process. First, thoroughly analyze the specific hazard within the local context, gathering all relevant data on causes, behavior, and risk factors. Second, consult and apply relevant federal, state, and local regulations and guidelines for hazard assessment and mitigation. Third, develop a comprehensive strategy that integrates prevention, mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery, ensuring each component is tailored to the identified risks. Finally, continuously evaluate and adapt strategies based on new information, changing conditions, and lessons learned from past events. Question 17. Consider a scenario where a catastrophic earthquake has struck a densely populated region, triggering a multi-jurisdictional emergency response. Resources are pouring in from various states, federal agencies, and private donors, including food, water, medical supplies, shelter materials, and specialized equipment. The immediate need is overwhelming, and the sheer volume and diversity of incoming aid are creating significant logistical challenges. The Emergency Management Agency is struggling to effectively categorize, track, and deploy these resources to the most critical areas while maintaining financial accountability and ensuring equitable distribution. What is the most effective process optimization strategy for managing these diverse and rapidly arriving resources? Option A. Focus solely on the immediate distribution of essential supplies like food and water, deferring the detailed categorization, tracking, and financial reconciliation of all resources until the immediate crisis has subsided. Option B. Immediately deploy all incoming resources to the hardest-hit areas based on initial reports, while establishing a temporary, decentralized system for tracking and financial oversight managed by local authorities. Option C. Allow individual response teams and local jurisdictions to independently procure and manage their own resources as needed, with minimal central coordination to expedite delivery to their specific areas of greatest need. Option D. Prioritize the establishment of a centralized resource management system that standardizes resource typing, implements a unified ordering and tracking mechanism, centralizes financial oversight, and develops clear protocols for donation and volunteer management from the outset. The correct answer is B. Immediately deploy all incoming resources to the hardest-hit areas based on initial reports, while establishing a temporary, decentralized system for tracking and financial oversight managed by local authorities. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a significant challenge in resource management during a widespread, multi-jurisdictional emergency. The sheer volume and diversity of incoming resources, coupled with the need for rapid deployment and equitable distribution across affected areas, strains typical emergency management protocols. The lack of pre-established, standardized resource typing and the reliance on ad hoc donation management create significant inefficiencies and potential for waste or misallocation. Furthermore, the pressure to quickly satisfy immediate needs can lead to bypassing established financial controls and accountability mechanisms, increasing the risk of fraud, waste, and abuse. Professional emergency managers must navigate these complexities while adhering to strict legal and ethical obligations for resource accountability and effective public service. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach emphasizes the immediate establishment of a centralized, standardized resource management system that integrates resource typing, ordering, tracking, and financial accountability. This aligns with best practices and regulatory frameworks, e.g., National Incident Management System (NIMS) in the U.S. context, which guides resource management principles that mandate clear processes for resource acquisition, deployment, and demobilization. By prioritizing standardized resource typing, the system ensures that incoming resources are properly identified, categorized, and matched to specific needs, preventing duplication and ensuring efficient utilization. Implementing a robust tracking system from the point of origin to the point of use is crucial for accountability and informed decision-making. Centralizing financial oversight and establishing clear donation management protocols are essential for transparency, compliance with financial regulations, and maintaining public trust. This integrated approach optimizes the entire resource lifecycle, ensuring that resources are used effectively, efficiently, and ethically to support the emergency response. Incorrect approaches analysis. An approach that prioritizes immediate distribution of all incoming resources without proper typing or tracking leads to significant inefficiencies and potential waste. Sources may be sent to areas where they are not critically needed or are unsuitable for the intended purpose, violating principles of effective resource allocation and potentially leading to non-compliance with FEMA guidelines on resource utilization. Relying solely on local authorities to manage donations without central oversight creates a high risk of inconsistent practices, lack of accountability, and potential for fraud or mismanagement, which contravenes ethical obligations to the public and may violate state or federal laws governing charitable donations and emergency funds. An approach that delays financial reconciliation and documentation until after the immediate crisis has passed creates a substantial risk of financial impropriety and non-compliance with auditing requirements and federal grant regulations, potentially jeopardizing future funding and leading to legal repercussions. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a systematic incident command-based approach to resource management. This involves 1. Establishing clear incident objectives and resource needs. 2. Implementing standardized resource typing and ordering procedures consistent with national guidelines, e.g., NIMS. 3. Deploying a robust tracking system for all incoming and outgoing resources. 4. Centralizing financial oversight and ensuring all expenditures are documented and reconciled according to established financial management protocols. 5. Developing and implementing clear protocols for managing donations and volunteers, ensuring they are integrated into the overall response in a controlled and accountable manner. This structured process ensures that resource management is efficient, effective, accountable, and compliant with all applicable regulations and ethical standards. Question 18. The investigation demonstrates that a rapidly growing community, situated in a historically flood-prone area, is considering a significant expansion of residential and commercial development. While the existing levee system has historically provided protection, Recent hydrological studies suggest increased rainfall intensity and frequency, potentially exceeding the current levee's design capacity. The community leadership is prioritizing economic growth and has expressed reluctance to impose new development restrictions or invest heavily in additional flood control infrastructure, arguing that the current levee is sufficient and that development will generate needed tax revenue. As the professional emergency manager, PEM, for the region, what is the most appropriate course of action to ensure the community's long-term safety and resilience? Option A. Propose a phased approach to flood mitigation, starting with minor enhancements to the existing levee and deferring significant upgrades or new development restrictions until after a major flood event demonstrates the need. Option B. Advocate for a comprehensive floodplain management plan that includes a thorough risk assessment, evaluation of the existing levee's performance under projected climate conditions, and the development of a multifaceted mitigation strategy incorporating both structural upgrades and non-structural measures like updated building codes and land use planning to manage development in high-risk zones. Option C. Support the community's immediate development plans, focusing resources on post-disaster response capabilities to manage potential flooding events, as the existing levee has a proven track record of protection. Option D. Recommend prioritizing economic development by approving all proposed construction projects and focusing on public awareness campaigns about flood safety, assuming the existing levee will continue to offer adequate protection. Correct answer is B. Advocate for a comprehensive floodplain management plan that includes a thorough risk assessment, evaluation of the existing levee's performance under projected climate conditions, and the development of a multifaceted mitigation strategy incorporating both structural upgrades and non-structural measures like updated building codes and land use planning to manage development in high-risk zones. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between immediate community needs for development and long-term disaster mitigation imperatives, particularly concerning flood risk. The professional emergency manager, PEM, must balance competing interests while adhering to established regulatory frameworks and ethical obligations to protect public safety. Careful judgment is required to navigate political pressures, economic considerations, and the scientific understanding of flood hazards. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a comprehensive, science-based floodplain management strategy that aligns with federal and state regulations governing flood mitigation. This approach emphasizes understanding the dynamic nature of flood risk, incorporating current hydrological data, and implementing a multifaceted mitigation plan that includes both structural and non-structural measures. Adherence to guidelines such as those from FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency, regarding floodplain management, building codes that incorporate flood resilience, and land use planning principles is paramount. Ethically, this approach fulfills the PEM's duty to safeguard the community from preventable harm and promote sustainable development. An incorrect approach that proposes to solely rely on the construction of a new levee without a thorough risk assessment and consideration of alternative or complementary mitigation strategies is professionally unacceptable. This fails to meet regulatory requirements for comprehensive floodplain management, which mandates a holistic approach beyond single structural solutions. Ethically, it risks creating a false sense of security, potentially leading to increased development in vulnerable areas and exposing the community to unacceptable risks if the levee is overtopped or fails. It also neglects the potential for non-structural mitigation measures that might be more cost-effective or environmentally sound. Another incorrect approach that suggests prioritizing economic development over any new flood mitigation measures, citing existing infrastructure as sufficient, is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This directly contravenes the principles of disaster mitigation and public safety mandated by emergency management regulations. It demonstrates a disregard for the potential for catastrophic loss of life and property and ignores the evolving nature of flood risk due to climate change or upstream development. Ethically, this approach prioritizes short-term economic gains over the long-term well-being and safety of the community. A third incorrect approach that advocates for a reactive, post-disaster response strategy rather than proactive mitigation is also professionally unsound. This fails to meet the core objectives of emergency management, which emphasize preparedness and mitigation to reduce the impact of disasters. Regulatory frameworks consistently promote mitigation as a critical component of disaster resilience. Ethically, this approach is irresponsible as it knowingly allows the community to remain vulnerable to predictable hazards, increasing the likelihood and severity of future losses. The professional reasoning process for similar situations should involve a systematic evaluation of the hazard, vulnerability, and risk. This includes consulting scientific data, relevant regulations e.g. National Flood Insurance Program requirements, state building codes, and engaging stakeholders. A multi-hazard approach, considering the interplay of different risks, is crucial. Decision-making should be guided by a risk-based framework, prioritizing actions that offer the greatest reduction in risk to life and property, while also considering economic feasibility, environmental impact, and social equity. The PEM must advocate for evidence-based strategies and clearly communicate the risks and benefits of different mitigation options to decision makers and the public. Question 19. Upon reviewing initial reports of a large-scale industrial accident involving a chemical plant explosion, you, as the professional emergency manager, are faced with a critical decision. The explosion has caused significant structural damage to nearby residential areas, and residents are evacuating, seeking immediate shelter. However, preliminary information suggests the potential for airborne chemical contaminants from the ruptured plant. Your resources are stretched thin, with limited personnel and equipment available for both search and rescue, damage assessment, and establishing mass care facilities. You must decide the immediate priority for deploying your limited resources. Option A. Deploy all available personnel and equipment to conduct immediate, widespread search and rescue operations in the most heavily damaged residential areas, assuming that shelter needs can be addressed once the immediate life-saving efforts are complete. Option B. Focus all available resources on debris removal and conducting a comprehensive damage assessment of the affected infrastructure to understand the scope of the incident before addressing shelter or hazardous materials concerns. Option C. Immediately establish a general public shelter in a nearby community center to provide immediate relief to displaced residents, while simultaneously initiating debris removal and damage assessment in the affected zones. Option D. Prioritize the establishment of a secure, controlled decontamination zone and initiate a rapid hazardous materials assessment of the affected area before opening any public shelter, while also tasking a limited team for initial search and rescue. The correct answer is C. Immediately establish a general public shelter in a nearby community center to provide immediate relief to displaced residents, while simultaneously initiating debris removal and damage assessment in the affected zones. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a significant ethical and professional challenge for an emergency manager. The core conflict lies between the immediate, visible need for shelter and the less apparent but critical requirement for hazardous materials, hazmat, response, and decontamination. The pressure to provide immediate relief can overshadow the necessity of ensuring the safety of both responders and the affected population from unseen chemical threats. The limited resources amplify this dilemma, forcing difficult prioritization decisions. Professional judgment is required to balance immediate humanitarian needs with long-term safety and regulatory compliance. Correct approach analysis. Prioritizing the establishment of a secure, controlled decontamination zone and initiating hazmat assessment before opening a general shelter is the best professional practice. This approach aligns with the fundamental principles of emergency management, particularly those outlined in U.S. federal guidelines such as FEMA National Incident Management System, NIMS, and the principles of the Incident Command System, ICS. These frameworks emphasize the importance of incident stabilization and life safety, which includes preventing further harm from hazardous substances. Ethically, this approach upholds the duty of care to protect both the public and responders from known or suspected hazards. It also adheres to regulatory requirements concerning hazardous materials handling and public health, ensuring that the response does not inadvertently create a secondary disaster. Incorrect approaches analysis. Opening a general shelter without addressing the potential hazmat contamination is a critical failure. This violates the principle of life safety by exposing vulnerable populations to hazardous substances, potentially leading to widespread illness, injury, or death. It also disregards regulatory mandates for hazardous materials response and public health protection, creating significant legal and ethical liabilities. Such an approach prioritizes visible relief over fundamental safety and preparedness, focusing solely on debris removal and damage assessment, while neglecting the immediate threat of contamination, is also professionally unacceptable. While these tasks are important for recovery, they are secondary to mitigating an active or potential hazard that poses an immediate threat to life and health. This approach fails to adhere to the incident stabilization phase of emergency management and ignores the critical need for hazmat assessment and control. Diverting all available personnel and equipment to search and rescue operations without any consideration for hazmat assessment or decontamination is a dangerous oversight. While search and rescue is a high-priority life-saving function, it must be conducted within a framework that accounts for all potential hazards. Deploying teams into a potentially contaminated area without proper protective equipment or decontamination protocols puts responders at extreme risk and could lead to the spread of contamination. This demonstrates a failure to implement a comprehensive incident action plan that addresses all critical operational needs. Professional reasoning. Emergency managers must employ a systematic decision-making process that begins with a thorough hazard and risk assessment. This involves identifying all potential threats, including chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear, and explosive CBRNE hazards. The Incident Command System, ICS, provides a structured framework for this, emphasizing the establishment of command, clear objectives, and resource allocation based on priorities. In this scenario, the potential for hazmat contamination necessitates an immediate assessment and mitigation strategy before broader sheltering operations can commence safely. This aligns with the all hazards approach to emergency management, ensuring that responses are comprehensive and address the full spectrum of potential dangers. Ethical considerations, such as the duty to protect, must guide decisions, ensuring that immediate relief does not come at the cost of greater harm. Question 20. Operational review demonstrates that following a significant natural disaster, the preliminary damage assessment, PDA, has been completed, indicating potential eligibility for federal assistance. However, there is a divergence in stakeholder priorities regarding the subsequent steps for assessing the full scope of the disaster's impact and determining recovery needs. Which approach best aligns with the regulatory framework for disaster recovery and ensures a comprehensive and defensible needs analysis? Option A. Immediately initiate a detailed assessment of housing units and their habitability, prioritizing the most affected neighborhoods and deferring detailed infrastructure and economic impact assessments until housing needs are largely met. Option B. Conduct a detailed damage assessment of all critical infrastructure, e.g., transportation, utilities, public facilities, and then proceed with a comprehensive needs assessment that integrates housing, economic, and public service restoration requirements, utilizing standardized data collection and reporting methodologies. Option C. Rely on informal feedback from community leaders and emergency responders to compile a list of perceived needs, without conducting formal detailed damage assessments or employing structured needs assessment methodologies, to expedite the allocation of available resources. Option D. Focus primarily on quantifying the immediate economic losses to businesses and industries, using this data to advocate for targeted financial aid, and conducting only a cursory review of physical damage to infrastructure and housing. The correct answer is A. Immediately initiate a detailed assessment of housing units and their habitability, prioritizing the most affected neighborhoods and deferring detailed infrastructure and economic impact assessments until housing needs are largely met. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a professional emergency manager, PEM, to balance the immediate need for actionable damage assessment data with the long-term requirements for comprehensive needs analysis, all while adhering to specific U.S. federal regulatory frameworks, primarily FEMA guidelines and the Stafford Act. The pressure to quickly identify critical needs for resource allocation can lead to shortcuts that compromise the accuracy and completeness of the assessment, impacting the effectiveness of disaster recovery efforts and potentially jeopardizing future funding. The stakeholder perspective adds complexity, as different agencies and community groups will have varying priorities and interpretations of damage and needs. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach emphasizes a phased damage assessment process, beginning with a preliminary damage assessment, PDA, to establish initial impact and eligibility for federal assistance, followed by a detailed damage assessment DDA, to quantify the extent of damage to specific infrastructure and private property. Crucially, this is then integrated with a robust needs assessment that employs established methodologies, e.g., FEMA Public Assistance Program guidance, hazard mitigation planning requirements, to identify not just what is broken, but what is required to restore, rebuild, and mitigate future risks. This aligns with the Stafford Act's intent to provide assistance for disaster-related losses and the regulatory requirement for accurate data collection and analysis to support funding requests and program implementation. The focus on data collection and analysis using standardized tools and reporting formats ensures transparency, accountability, and the ability to track progress, all of which are critical for effective disaster recovery and compliance with federal mandates. Incorrect approaches analysis, an approach that solely focuses on immediate housing needs without a comprehensive infrastructure assessment, fails to meet the regulatory requirement for a holistic understanding of disaster impact. This overlooks the interconnectedness of infrastructure, e.g., transportation, utilities, with housing recovery and economic stability, potentially leading to incomplete recovery plans and inefficient resource allocation. Ethically, it neglects the broader community impact, an approach that prioritizes economic impact analysis above all else. Neglecting the physical damage assessment is also flawed. While economic recovery is vital, it is predicated on the restoration of essential services and infrastructure. Without a clear understanding of physical damage, the economic impact analysis will be speculative and may not accurately reflect the true needs for recovery funding. This deviates from the regulatory framework that mandates a systematic assessment of physical damage as a precursor to determining recovery needs. An approach that relies on anecdotal evidence and informal stakeholder input without structured data collection and analysis fails to meet the rigorous documentation and reporting standards required by federal regulations. This lack of systematic data collection and analysis undermines the credibility of the assessment, making it difficult to justify funding requests and track the effectiveness of recovery programs. It also presents an ethical challenge in ensuring equitable distribution of resources based on objective data rather than subjective perceptions. Professional reasoning. Professional emergency managers must adopt a systematic, phased approach to damage assessment and needs analysis, grounded in regulatory requirements and best practices. This involves understanding the distinct purposes of PDA and DDA, integrating them with comprehensive needs assessment methodologies, and employing rigorous data collection and analysis techniques. The decision-making process should involve 1. Identifying relevant federal and state regulations, e.g., Stafford Act, FEMA guidance. 2. Understanding the specific objectives of each assessment phase. 3. Selecting appropriate data collection tools and methodologies. 4. Engaging stakeholders collaboratively while ensuring data integrity. 5. Documenting all findings meticulously for reporting and accountability. This structured approach ensures that recovery efforts are data-driven, compliant, and effective in addressing the multifaceted needs of a disaster-affected community.